When people hear the word audit, they often imagine a tense inspection where someone hunts for mistakes, writes a report, and then disappears while everyone goes back to normal. In privacy, that mindset is exactly why many audits fail to matter, because an audit that only produces findings without changing behavior becomes a ritual instead of a risk reduction tool. A privacy audit that drives real remediation is different because it is designed from the beginning to lead to decisions, fixes, and measurable improvement, not just documentation. It focuses on whether data processing in the real world matches what the organization claims, what it intended, and what it is allowed to do, and then it turns gaps into actionable work that actually gets done. For brand new learners, the most important idea is that a privacy audit is not a one-time event. It is a structured way of checking reality, prioritizing risk, and closing the loop so the same problems do not repeat. It also has a human side, because remediation requires cooperation across teams that may not speak the same language or share the same priorities. The goal is to learn how to run privacy audits in a way that produces lasting fixes, not just a binder of observations. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong audit starts with clarity about what you are auditing and why, because vague scope creates vague outcomes. Privacy can touch almost everything, so if you try to audit everything at once, you will either drown in detail or deliver a shallow report that nobody can act on. A practical approach is to define the system, product, process, or business unit you are evaluating and to tie that scope to a clear risk reason, such as recent incidents, new features, sensitive data, high-volume processing, or major vendor reliance. The why matters because it helps determine what evidence you need and how deep you must go, which keeps the audit focused and fair. Beginners sometimes assume the audit's purpose is to catch wrongdoing, but in healthy programs, the purpose is to validate controls and reduce risk before it becomes harm. That means you choose scope that can be meaningfully examined and improved in a reasonable time, rather than trying to judge the entire organization in one pass. Scope clarity also helps with expectations, because teams are more willing to engage when they know what will be reviewed and what success looks like. If the scope is precise, remediation can be precise, which is how audits become useful. Once scope is clear, you need an audit lens, which is the set of privacy expectations the system is supposed to meet. That lens can include internal policies, privacy principles like minimization and purpose limitation, commitments made in notices, contractual obligations, and applicable legal requirements. But the key is that it must be explicit and understandable. For beginners, it helps to think of the lens as the rules of the game, because you cannot fairly judge a system without stating what standard you are judging it against. A common audit failure is mixing standards midstream, where some findings are based on law, some on personal opinion, and some on security best practices, leaving the team unsure what is required versus recommended. A strong audit distinguishes between requirements and improvements, and it explains that distinction in plain language. Another common failure is treating privacy policy text as the only standard, when in practice privacy risk can exist even if a policy is broad enough to cover it. The audit lens should also include the organization's own stated values, because trust is damaged when behavior diverges from what the organization wants to represent. When the lens is clear, findings feel grounded rather than arbitrary, which makes remediation more likely. Evidence is where audits become real, because you cannot remediate a reality you have not verified. In privacy audits, evidence is not only documents, though documents matter, but also system behavior and operational practices. You might look at data inventories, vendor agreements, retention rules, access control policies, and incident records, but you also need to validate whether systems actually follow those rules. For example, a retention policy that says logs are kept for 30 days means little if the log platform retains them for 2 years by default. A notice that says data is used only for account management means little if analytics events include identifiers that feed advertising profiles. Beginners sometimes think auditing means reading policies and checking boxes, but privacy auditing requires triangulation, which means comparing what people say, what documents claim, and what systems do. Evidence can include sample data records, configuration screens, access logs, and interviews with the people who run the process day to day. The goal is not to embarrass anyone, but to find the gap between intention and implementation, because that gap is where risk lives. Strong evidence gathering produces findings that are hard to dismiss and easy to act on. A useful technique in privacy auditing is to follow the data, because data flows reveal both compliance and risk more clearly than organizational charts. You start with a data category, such as customer contact information or usage telemetry, then trace how it is collected, where it is stored, who can access it, and where it is shared. Along the way, you ask whether each step is necessary for the stated purpose, whether controls limit exposure, and whether retention is bounded. This approach naturally surfaces hidden dependencies, such as third-party services receiving event data, internal teams exporting datasets, or backups retaining old records. It also helps you identify where a control breaks, such as when a system logs sensitive fields or when deletion requests do not propagate to vendor systems. Beginners often assume privacy risk is located in a single place, like a database, but in reality risk is distributed across pipelines, tools, and human processes. Following the data gives the audit a clear narrative that teams can understand, and it produces remediation targets that are concrete, like removing a field from an event payload or tightening access roles. When you can tell a coherent data story, stakeholders can see why a change matters. Audits should also examine governance and decision-making, because many privacy failures come from weak processes rather than deliberate misuse. If teams can add a new tracking tool without review, privacy risk will grow even if everyone has good intentions. If vendors can be on board without privacy vetting, data sharing will expand by default. If retention periods are not owned by anyone, data will accumulate. Governance evidence includes whether there are triggers for privacy review, whether reviews are documented, and whether changes are monitored after launch. It also includes whether privacy responsibilities are assigned, because remediation fails when findings do not have clear owners. Beginners sometimes think governance is boring paperwork, but governance is the system that prevents the same mistake from happening again and again. A remediation-driven audit does not only fix today's symptoms, it strengthens the processes that created those symptoms so the organization improves over time. When governance is audited alongside technical controls, remediation becomes durable rather than temporary. One of the most important parts of a remediation-driven audit is how findings are written, because the phrasing can either invite action or trigger defensiveness. Findings should be specific, evidence-based, and connected to risk in a way that non-experts can understand. Instead of saying the system is non-compliant or risky in a vague way, a strong finding describes what is happening, why it matters, and what could go wrong, while avoiding blame language. It also distinguishes between a control gap and a one-time mistake, because remediation strategies differ. Another helpful practice is to describe the expected state, not just the current problem, so the team has a clear target. Beginners often think the audit report is the deliverable, but the real deliverable is a plan for change, and the report must be written to support that plan. Findings that are too generic lead to generic remediation, which rarely changes anything. Findings that are too technical can be ignored by decision makers, so the best findings connect technical facts to business and user impact. Clear writing is a remediation control because it turns discovery into action. Prioritization is where privacy audits often succeed or fail, because an audit can uncover more issues than an organization can fix at once. If everything is marked high priority, nothing is truly prioritized, and teams either freeze or cherry-pick easy fixes that do not reduce the biggest risks. A remediation-driven approach ranks findings based on likely harm, sensitivity of data, scale of impact, ease of exploitation, and whether the issue violates core commitments or legal obligations. It also considers whether a fix reduces multiple risks at once, such as implementing a retention control that reduces exposure across many datasets. Beginners sometimes assume prioritization is purely subjective, but it can be grounded in consistent criteria, even if judgment is still required. Another important aspect is sequencing, because some remediation depends on other work, like building a data inventory before you can enforce deletion across systems. A good audit produces a realistic remediation roadmap, not just a list of problems. When teams can see what to do first and why, they are more likely to start and keep going. Remediation requires ownership and project management discipline because privacy fixes compete with feature work and operational demands. A strong audit outcome assigns each finding to an accountable owner, sets expectations for timelines, and defines what completion looks like in measurable terms. Completion should be verified, not assumed, because it is easy for a team to say a fix is done while the underlying data flow still exists. For example, if the remediation is to stop collecting a field, verification might involve checking that new events no longer contain it and that old data is handled appropriately. Another example is tightening access control, where verification includes confirming the new role definitions and reviewing access logs. Beginners might assume privacy teams do the fixes, but privacy teams typically coordinate, advise, and verify, while product, engineering, legal, and operations implement changes. That means the audit must produce tasks that fit into normal development and operational workflows, not abstract recommendations that nobody can translate into work. When remediation is managed like real work with owners, deadlines, and verification, audits stop being ceremonial and start being transformative. Communication is another ingredient that determines whether remediation actually happens, because people need to understand why the work matters and how it connects to broader goals. If remediation is framed as compliance theater, teams will resist, but if it is framed as reducing user harm, preventing incidents, and protecting long-term trust, it can gain support. Audit communication should be tailored to the audience, with executives receiving risk summaries and decision points, while implementers receive concrete evidence and technical implications. It should also include acknowledgement of what the team is doing well, because audits that only criticize can damage morale and cooperation. Beginners sometimes think auditors should be purely tough, but in privacy, lasting change often requires collaboration and trust between auditors and operational teams. That does not mean softening findings. It means presenting them in a way that invites improvement rather than conflict. Another important communication practice is closing the loop publicly inside the organization, so teams see that remediation is expected and valued, not optional. When the organization treats remediation as part of quality, not as punishment, audits produce better outcomes. Audits should also incorporate follow-up, because remediation without follow-up is just hope. Follow-up can include retesting after fixes, checking whether policies were updated, and confirming whether new controls are being used in day-to-day work. It can also include monitoring metrics, such as whether retention periods are actually enforced or whether vendor reviews happen on schedule. Another follow-up practice is to capture lessons learned, such as identifying why the gap occurred, whether it was due to unclear ownership, weak change management, or lack of training. Those lessons should feed into program improvements, like updating review triggers, improving templates, or offering targeted training for teams that handle sensitive data. Beginners sometimes see audits as isolated events, but the most effective audits are part of a cycle of continuous improvement. If the same issues appear in multiple audits, that signals a systemic weakness that needs a systemic fix. Follow-up is what turns an audit from a snapshot into a process that shifts behavior over time. A related concept is audit readiness, which is not about hiding problems, but about building systems that are easy to evaluate and improve. Audit readiness includes maintaining accurate data inventories, documenting vendor relationships, having clear retention rules, and ensuring privacy reviews are recorded for major changes. It also includes making sure teams know where to find evidence, because audits consume less time and produce better results when information is organized. Beginners might think readiness is about preparing for external auditors, but it is also about making internal audits efficient and meaningful. When an organization is ready, the audit can focus on real risk rather than on chasing basic facts like where data is stored. Readiness also helps remediation, because if you can quickly identify owners and system components, fixes can be implemented faster. Another benefit is that readiness supports transparency, because you can more accurately describe data practices to users and regulators. The trade-off is that readiness requires ongoing maintenance, but that maintenance is often cheaper than scrambling after an incident or facing repeated audit findings. A remediation-driven program treats readiness as part of building a reliable privacy culture. Running privacy audits that drive real remediation means designing the entire audit as a bridge from discovery to change. You begin with clear scope and an explicit evaluation lens so the audit is fair and focused. You gather evidence that reflects real system behavior, not just paperwork, and you follow the data to reveal where risk actually lives. You write findings with specificity and respect, connecting evidence to user and business impact so they are actionable and credible. You prioritize based on consistent criteria and produce a realistic roadmap rather than a panic-inducing list. You assign owners, define measurable completion, and verify fixes so remediation is real, not claimed. You communicate in ways that build cooperation and maintain accountability, and you follow up so improvements stick and lessons feed into stronger governance. When audits work this way, they stop being dreaded events and become one of the most practical tools a privacy program has for turning principles into everyday, risk-reducing behavior.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.